Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of your vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension is hanging. Now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and move to our center cap. If you were to look along the center cap and the rim, you're going to find a little slot. You can use a small pry bar, carefully get in between, but be careful not to damage your wheel. Go ahead and pop that off of there. We'll give it a quick inspection. Set it aside. After that, go ahead and remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that that's out of the way, the next thing we want to do is just have a quick look at what's going on. We're going to have to take this entire knuckle area and the brakes right off of here so we can have access down in this area. Now with all that said, let's go ahead and follow this ABS wire, which is the small wire, all the way up, and you're going to notice it goes up into the engine compartment right along the wheel well. Let's make our way into the engine compartment real quick and disconnect it. So inside the engine compartment, I can find that ABS wire, and then I can see right where it connects into. To remove that wire, you're going to want to go ahead and press on the little square tab. Once you have it pressed in, you can go ahead and pull the wire out of the harness. For this, I'm just going to use a small flathead screwdriver. I'll press down, gently twist. Once it starts sliding out, you can go ahead and pull it right out of there. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, you need to take a peek. If you see any funny colors, it's probably corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. This looks fine, so let's go ahead and push this down. And let's get back into the wheel well. Now from back inside the wheel well, let's continue on with a small trim tool. If you were to follow the ABS wire up behind the upper control arm, you're going to find a little area that it mounts into. I'm just going to go ahead and pry that right out of its position in the strut tower. Let's pull that down. Now we're going to dislodge it from the flex hose. Now we can move along to this area right here. For this clip, just use a small pocket screwdriver. We're going to carefully get underneath this area, gently pry. Should want to separate. Go ahead and pull the wire out of there. Now, of course, you're going to want to be very careful with this ABS wire. It's extremely delicate. You don't want to rip it, tear it, or break it in any way. Go ahead and tie that up in an area that it's not going to get caught on anything as we continue. Now it's time to remove the sway bar link. Looking along the bottom of it, you're going to find a 14mm head, and that's actually a bolt that goes all the way up through this shank to this top nut. Now with that said, we're going to hold the top nut with some pliers and use a 14mm down along the bottom to remove this. Alright, that's something that's very common. If you were to look along the side of this, generally you can see that there's a slit, and of course moisture makes its way inside. If this happens, just go ahead and cut this right out of the way. Alright. Now at this point, obviously if your sway bar link broke during the removal process, you're going to have to go ahead and replace it while continuing. Let's move along to the outer tie rod end. Generally on these, you're going to find some sort of locking cotter pin. Go ahead and remove that, and then remove the nut. Now we can remove the nut with a 21mm. Lift your outer tie rod end out of the knuckle. Give it a quick inspection. Go ahead and set that aside. Now let's move along to the other side of the knuckle where the brake caliper is going to be located. We're going to have to remove 2 18mm headed bolts for the caliper bracket. There's one here, and there's one just right above it. Let's go ahead and remove the pair. As I start removing it, I'm going to go ahead and fully remove the first one, put it back in a couple threads, and then I'll just go ahead and remove the second one. After I get the second one completely out, I can fully remove the first. It's a good idea to inspect the bolts as you go. Let's carefully grab that caliper. We're going to slide it off of the rotor. Once you have it off, it's a good idea to just take a peek at the brakes. You want to make sure they don't look like they're worn at an angle, and also make sure it doesn't look like you can see any fluid. If you do, it's probably brake fluid, and that's no good. You'd have to replace the caliper. This one looks fine, so I'm going to put it aside, making sure I put no pressure on my flex hose. Remove your rotor, inspect it, set it aside. Let's remove our 30mm axle nut. The next thing you're going to want to do is use a hammer and a punch. We're going to come right in the center of the axle and try to break it free from the wheel bearing. You can see right in here, there's some splines. If yours looks like it's rusted, just apply a little bit of penetrant. Once you're sure it's broken free, we can continue on to our upper ball joint nut. Let's use an 18mm to remove this nut. Go ahead and take that nut and put it on just a couple threads. Not very much so it feels like it's bottomed out against anything, just so when we go ahead and bonk this to break it free, the knuckle can't fall down and potentially hurt you. Now that we have that separated, let's continue on with a safety strap. I'm going to go ahead and take this, put it through the ball joint hole in the knuckle. I'll bring it up and around, go ahead and tie it into position so it's nice and tight. Now at this point, this can flex around. Let's move to our lower ball joint. Typically, you're going to find some sort of locking cotter pin, but if it's rotted inside there, just go ahead and break off the piece that's hanging out. Use a 24mm socket to remove the nut. Now we're just going to go ahead and take that ball joint nut, put it on a couple threads, and then we can start breaking the knuckle free from the lower control arm. Let's continue on with a pickle fork and a hammer. I'm going to come right in between this area and get ready to separate it. Once that's separated, go ahead and remove your tool. Now we're going to lift up on the knuckle a little bit. We'll remove our safety strap. Holding onto the knuckle, I'm going to lift it up again, remove that lower ball joint nut. Now we can start sliding it down and remove the axle from the wheel bearing at the same time. Let's go ahead and set this aside. Now at this point, we're going to go ahead and take the axle, put it up and over the sway bar, right like this. I put a safety strap to hold it in place so I don't have to worry about it falling on me. Now we can continue on to this area right here. For this, we're going to use a 24mm socket. This is a through bolt. It comes all the way through to the other side of the control arm, right on through the front strut. Let's go ahead and remove this. We'll set that nut aside. And then, now let's use our hammer. Keep in mind, as you're driving this bolt out, the control arm could potentially move, so don't go underneath it while you're doing this. Down. Remove your bolt and give it a quick inspection. Now let's move along underneath the front of the lower control arm. Right here, you're going to see a 30mm nut. This is going to be under extreme torque. When you loosen it, be very careful. We're just going to loosen it just enough that we can pivot the control arm around a little bit. Now let's make our way up into the engine compartment. We're going to be looking along each side of the vehicle for the 3 upper mounting nuts. Now over on the passenger side, it's going to be easy to access them right underneath this area. I can get to them very easy. But if this was in the way, I'll show you how to get it out of there. Let's start right here. This is the mass airflow sensor. Squeeze this tab, go ahead and give it a little wiggle and pull it off. We'll give that connector a quick inspection. Go ahead and set that wire aside. Now we're going to be looking for 2 tabs underneath the air filter housing. Go ahead and grab onto that, lift it up. Now we can grab onto the top of the air filter housing and we're going to carefully lift it up and slide it towards the center of the vehicle. Now this is starting to come up and out of the way. You're going to see that you have a hose right here. Let's go ahead and pop that out of there. Keep following it up. Now you have a cable that's inside this resting position. Go ahead and lift it up out of there. For this, we're going to use a T25 Torx bit. It essentially looks like a star. There's going to be a second screw right here. Let's get this oil cap out of the way. Don't drop this into the engine. Let's lift up this cover. After that's out of the way, let's move along to this clamp right here. We're going to use an 8mm. We're only going to loosen this up enough that we can grab this hose and pull it out of the way. Let's remove this from the vehicle. Now you can also make your way up and in between this area of the wheel well and the strut tower to remove the top 3 nuts. It's a little bit harder to access them, especially if you're using an air tool. Generally for this, you're going to have to use a hand tool. Let's put a 13mm socket on these. It's important when you're removing these 3 mounting nuts, you do not want to ever touch the center nut. Don't touch the center nut. Okay, so it's time for the 3rd and last mounting nut for this. Keep in mind, this is the last thing holding this inside the vehicle. Once you get it loose, you're going to want to make sure you're holding onto that strut so it doesn't fall down. Now we can carefully grab onto this, and we're going to start pulling it out of the wheel well. As we do, we need to go ahead and rotate it out of the hole. There it is, friends. Okay, friends, now it's time to install our brand new front strut. Let's have a look along the top. On the top, you can see that you have your 2 mounting studs that should go along the rear, and then you also have the 3rd one up along the front. Once again, we're not doing anything with the center. Let's go ahead and put this in position. Once we have it up and inside the strut tower, we'll go ahead and start putting on the nuts. To put it into position, we're going to have to come in up along the top of the control arm and carefully put it in. After that, we'll bring it down a little bit and try putting it into the strut tower. Let's slide it up. Now we can start on all three of our mounting nuts. Now let's bottom each of these three nuts out, and then we'll torque them to 22 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install the air inlet. Let's start with the upper area of the air filter box. We're going to slide it right in along this area. Now we'll go ahead and press it down. Let's lock it in. Let's make our way up here to the mass airflow sensor. Listen for a click, give it a tug, make sure it's secure. Follow it down to that hose. Slide that in. Let's make our way up here. We're going to put this onto the throttle body. Go ahead and line it up and then press it in. It's very important to make sure when you're putting this on, you have it completely bottomed out against the throttle body as far as it can go. After that, you also need to make sure that you have this nice and tight. Otherwise, you might have dirty or unmetered air making its way into the engine. Let's put this back in place. All right, now we can move along to our black cover. We're going to go ahead and put this in place, right up along the top here. Now, of course, you're going to want to make sure you line up both of your bolt holes. After that, go ahead and start in each of the mounting bolts. Once they're both started, you can go ahead and snug them up. Let's go ahead and put on our oil cap. All right, let's make our way back into the wheel well. The next thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you clean the threads on your mounting bolt for your lower strut to control arm. After that, we're going to continue on with a pry bar in between this hole of the lower control arm. I'm going to use a small spacer right in between this area, and then I'm going to slowly start prying down. We want to try to line up the area of the control arm with the strut. Now we can apply some red thread locker to the threads. After that, go ahead and start the nut on there. Once you've done that, let's continue on by applying a little bit of pressure underneath the lower control arm. Now, as we start putting pressure underneath this, you want to pay very close attention to a couple different things. First of all, you want to make sure you don't lift this up to the point you're removing it from either your jack stands or even the lift that you're working on. Aside from that, we're only going up enough to put this under the proper amount of pressure as if it was driving down the road. So essentially, as you start lifting this up, you're going to notice that it gets to a point where it really just doesn't want to go any higher than that. All right. Now we can go ahead and use our 24mm socket. We'll go ahead and snug this up. After we have it snug, we're going to torque it to 258 foot-pounds. Now we can put on the forward nut. Something that I need to mention is it's a good idea to go ahead and replace these nuts. If you're not replacing it, you need to make sure that you put on some red thread locker. We'll just go ahead and take this. We're going to bottom it out. After we have it bottomed out, you're going to want to torque this to 259 foot-pounds. Now, once you're sure both of these are nice and tight, let's continue on by lowering the lower control arm. Let's get our hub back on here. We're going to try to line up the axle shaft with the backside of the bearing. At the same time, let's also be lining up the ball joint stud with the bottom of the knuckle. We're going to go ahead and slide it up, and then we can put the ball joint nut on. Now, once you have it slid up there, go ahead and start on your ball joint nut. Let's put the nut on the upper ball joint. Let's go ahead and bottom this out, and then we'll torque it to 41 foot-pounds. Now we can bottom out the lower ball joint nut, and then we'll torque this to 129 foot-pounds. Now that you have it torqued, the next thing that you're going to want to do is go ahead and pay attention to the slot on the nut in comparison to the hole in the stud. If it's not lined up, you need to continue tightening this nut until the very next slot does. After that, you can put in your locking cotter pin. Go ahead and pin this over. Let's get the outer tie rod in place. Once it's in, go ahead and put on your nut. Now we'll torque this to 52 foot-pounds. After that, you know what to do. Make sure that the slot matches up with the hole, put in your locking cotter pin. Now the next thing that you're going to want to do before you go ahead and put the rotor on is to pay attention to the hub mating surface here. We want to make sure that it's clean and free of any debris, and then after that just apply some copper never seize. Also, looking at the back side of your rotor, you want to make sure that right here where it's supposed to mate up against that wheel bearing is nice and clean and free of debris as well. Assuming everything looks good, let's go ahead and put the rotor on. Now at this point, I always just put one of my lug nuts on there, only to hold the rotor in place while I continue. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean down the rotor braking surface on the outer aspect and on the inner aspect. You can just go ahead and wipe this down and turn it as needed. Now it's going to be time to get ready to remount our caliper. Before you do, make sure you clean the threads on your mounting bolt and apply some red thread locker. Now when we put the caliper in place, you want to pay special attention to the flex hose itself. When it goes up on here, you want to make sure that it doesn't look like it's twisted like a pigtail in any way. That's going to restrict brake flow. Let's go ahead and start in both of our mounting bolts. After we have them started in, we can bottom them out and torque them to manufacturer's specification. Once you have them snug, go ahead and torque each of them to 90 foot-pounds. Let's start remounting our ABS wire. Now for this, you of course want to make sure that it runs along the brake hose, and it's going to make its way up along the strut tower behind the upper control arm. It's going to make its way all the way up here, and then of course we'll be plugging it in inside of the engine compartment. Let's start putting this in place. Now as you follow this, you're going to find that there's a small groove right here that needs to fit into this clip. We'll go ahead and latch that in. Listen for a click. Make sure it's secure as we go down the line. We're going to make sure we press that into the strut tower where it needs to be. There we are. Let's take that ABS wire, we'll put it right up here. Make sure you put it someplace where you will not forget to reconnect it. Now obviously you're going to want to go ahead and take this all apart. At this point, I have my long stud, or my bolt. I have one of my washers. I have a bushing with the little piton facing up. Now we can go ahead and put it through the bottom of the control arm. As we start bringing it up, let's continue on with another bushing. This time, we're going to have the little piton facing down towards the control arm. Now we can do one of our washers. Now it's time for the spacer. Let's bring this up so we can continue working on it. Another washer, another bushing with a little piton facing up towards where the sway bar is going to be. And now we're going to have to go ahead and start pulling up on this sway bar a little bit so we can get this into position underneath this area. Now once you have it through the sway bar, let's continue on with one of our rubber bushings with the little piton facing towards the sway bar. One of our washers, and then of course our locking nut. Now it's going to be time to tighten this. When you tighten it, you only want to tighten so all the bushings are touching against either the sway bar and up against the lower control arm. Let's take a quick look. Now let's continue on to putting on our axle nut. For this, typically I'm going to use some red thread locker. We'll take the nut and put it right on there. Now at this point, you're going to want to bottom this out by hand with a ratchet. You never want to use an air tool on this because you don't want to compress the bearing in any way. Let's remove our lug nut. Now we can get the wheel up on here. At this point, you're going to want to start on all of your lug nuts. Bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we can continue on by torquing our lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheels safely back on the ground, we can continue on torquing our lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Now we can torque the axle nut to 184 foot-pounds. If you have a center cover, go ahead and put that on now. Make sure you line up the back with all of your lug nuts. Let's make our way back under the hood and reconnect our ABS wire. Get that in position. Slide it in, listen for a click. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Okay friends, I showed you how to put in one side strut. Now of course, whenever you do struts, you want to make sure you do them as a pair. So the process is going to be the exact same thing for the other side of the vehicle. After that, of course, take it for a ride, make sure you don't hear any funny noises, and get yourself a four-wheel alignment. Thank you for watching.